Welcome back to The Last American Vagabond. Well, we had an interesting, short, rapid, truncated interview yesterday because of some different technical issues. You can check out yesterday's interview if you'd like to find out more on that. We may touch on it today. We can start with some talk about StreamYard censorship, but I invited Vanessa Beeley back on to get into a deeper conversation about what we were discussing yesterday. And that has to do with the, psychological operations, as I see it, that are taking place around the world, and Syrian foreign policy, how it's related to what the U.S. and Israel and UK are doing. But we also got deeper into the ISIS kind of Israel-US background. And I wanted to get deeper into that today. We'll touch on that. Also, the larger kind of technocratic globalist agenda that's playing out around the world. So thank you for joining me yet again, Vanessa. It's good to have you back.
Oh, you're welcome. It's always good to be on with you, Ryan.
Well, thanks for making the time, because I know we just did this yesterday, but I'm sure we have an endless amount of things we could get into.
It was a bit under pressure yesterday.
Yeah, it was. Well, it's funny because I don't know if you saw, but I put in a little intro to make sure people knew that's why. And then people jumped in halfway. Yeah, they were like, "Why are you rushing her?" And I'm like, "Just check the beginning." But we got some good conversation in though, and I think there was some good, around that one point. But so today I wanted to touch on a few different things. I thought we'll start with some updates and some discussion around what's going on with the Epstein release. It's just interesting. It does relate to some larger points, some Venezuela overlap. But if you wanted to touch on it, we did touch yesterday, since we don't have any limitations on time today. You did mention some censorship discussion that you might have wanted to get into around StreamYard. Did you want to get into that at all?
Oh, no, that was on Substack. Oh, I'm hearing my own voice. That was on Substack, because I know that you've had some issues with Substack. And what appears to be happening now is that they're applying the online safety legislation in Australia and the UK, but only to target specific accounts.
Right, of course.
Like all of my posts, for example, that are being viewed by people in Australia and in the UK, and of course the UK is probably my biggest audience, are being asked for identification, right? Which of course is an intrusion on people's privacy and civil liberties as far as I'm concerned. They've already agreed to subscribe through a credit card. So if they're paying through a credit card, then that should be the only age identification that they need, right? Or age verification. And what's interesting is it seems to be isolated to specific accounts. There's a number of accounts that have reached out to me and vice versa, but other accounts are not being affected by it at all, which of course is the way that all these platforms eventually go, unfortunately. Either censorship through the payment platforms. I think you've had a problem with Stripe, which of course, unfortunately, is very much Zionist related. And we've all had problems in the past with Patreon, with YouTube, and to be fair, we should expect problems. We're kind of playing in their playing field. As much as you try to avoid the algorithms and so on, it's inevitable that at some point they're going to bring in measures that will silence the voices that are pissing them off, basically.
Right. Neither of us are saying that's justified, but obviously it's what you expect from people who are dishonest and want to shut down your opinions.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, I mean, PayPal as well, right? I mean, that's one of the ones that go back a while. The connections to today are quite obvious with the PayPal mafia. But I mentioned it yesterday, and censorship has been, it's not something that's disregarded. At one point it was like, oh, you're a conspiracy theory, that's not really happening. And now everyone's aware that it's part of the conversation. But the reason it's relevant that I wanted to get into it today is it seems to be very much ramping up. Not everyone can see it though, just like before, because only, like you're saying, only certain people are being affected. And even then you get even though we all know censorship happens, you still get that kind of like, but is it to you though? Kind of, within the community, it's like, we need to be very real about where this is going. And so I think StreamYard's a part of this right now. I hate to say that because it's so broadly used, but I'm seeing a lot of this stuff happen across a lot of different people. Substack, you're seeing Stripe. I got a couple of weird messages recently, and now I'm worried that rug's going to get pulled too. And so I'm trying to diversify, but it's important to know this is where it's going. What do you think is going to happen? And do you have any thoughts on any indications on that from Substack or anything else?
No, not really. I mean, the problem is that Substack only uses Stripe. I mean, there's no other option. On Patreon, I think you have now 3 options. right? It can also be paid directly into your bank account through Payoneer. But I guess all of these, touch wood, I haven't had, well, I say I haven't had any problems with Stripe, but I've never had as many subscriptions fail as I have had on Substack.
Yeah.
And of course, that didn't happen in the first year because the first year is the first payment. But this year, which is the second year that I'm on Substack, I'm getting, I would say, 10 to 15 failures every month. So I'm hemorrhaging subscribers, basically. You know, and most of it is billing failed, not requested by user, or some users are really sweet in that they actually give me a reason, or they don't have the money or whatever, you know, which is fine. It's not that I expect subscribers to stay with me, but what I don't like is I'm not sure they have any choice in it. I think both Stripe and the banks are being used to basically reduce the ability of people like us to survive. Absolutely. Because ultimately, you know, someone said to me yesterday, oh, so the safety of children is less important than your wages on Substack. I'm like,
as if that's even what's actually happening. Like
it's not even the point, you know, it's not about the financial aspect, although in my opinion we all have a right to earn money for the work that we do. I put myself regularly in danger in very high risk situations. I don't have insurance, I don't have the backing of the BBC or CNN or Channel 4 or any of these big corporate organizations who will take care of me if I'm injured in the field. It's all at my own risk. You take risks with putting out the information that you are going to be targeted and attacked by all manner of institutions and establishment organizations in the country that you're recording in and broadcasting from, right? So we take risks for what we do. And we don't do anything else. You know, I don't have a day job stacking shelves somewhere or anything like that. I can't even go back to my own country because the likelihood is I'll be arrested. I was detained before for my position, particularly on Syria. Now, of course, I have a very strong position on Palestine, and we know what's been happening to both British Palestinians who've taken, not Palestinians, sorry, young people in Britain who've taken direct action against the genocide who are now on hunger strike and reaching a very critical point in the hunger strike. And I've heard the other day that the prison is not even allowing an ambulance to come in and take care of one of the hunger strikers, a young girl who's, I think it's her 46th day. And her her vitals are basically closing down, you know, and they're not taking care of her. It's terrifying. I mean, this is literally what is going on under the radar because none of the mainstream media is reporting on this or on the targeting of dissidents or anti-genocide protesters, including the elderly in the UK that have been arrested for effectively saying no to a genocide in Gaza and no to the British government's support of a genocide in Gaza, right?
If somebody like Francesca Albanese can be deemed a terrorist and you know, with U.S. sanctions and you know, it's clear that nobody is outside of that grasp. You know, that's wild to me as a UN rapporteur. But you know, the censorship point, and I think we can get into that next if you'd like. But we can get to some Israel discussion in this. I've got some things lined up that we definitely need to discuss what's going on there. But to the censorship point, here's what I see coming in this. And this is what I saw with PayPal before. It started with, oh, look, you got some donations from some Iranian group, like we control where donations come from, you know, and whether you could even prove that's the case or not, you know. And so I said, okay, well, you know, they stopped them, whatever. And then that built into what, you know, later them just yanking what I think ended up being like $6,000. They seized the account, never saw it back, which is pretty common, I hear. You know, and so now I'm hearing some similar things from Stripe. I just the other day, I got an email saying a couple of, you know, possible fraudulent donate. And it's like, okay, what are you telling me for? I have no control over what people. So if you think it's fraudulent, then handle that. But I think it's about setting up a case to argue that I'm somehow involved or I'm not shutting it down. And so I worry what's going to come next.
I've also had that, actually. And the thing is, and this is what I try to explain to people, because someone was literally kind of yelling at me on email the other day because she'd subscribed the first year and then didn't want to pay this year. And I'm like, I'm really sorry. I have no control over the payments. You might receive an email from Substack saying, Vanessa Beeley, thanks you for your subscription, but that's an automatically generated email. It's not coming from me personally.
Right.
And I actually have very little oversight, and none of us do, over the payment system. Right. The Substack is actually, for me, incredibly difficult to navigate. Even now that I've been on it for sort of, I think, about 14 months, I found it quite hard to set up. And I still find it quite hard to navigate. Stripe is quite difficult to navigate. They told me the other day, oh, by the way, your phone number is showing on the invoices from Stripe. I'm like, well, how has that even happened? That's a breach of privacy laws, surely.
Yeah.
And then they give you this incredibly complicated system to go to Stripe and tell them, can you please take my private phone number off the invoices that you're sending to people all over the world? Because I don't want people sort of calling me up.
Yeah.
I'm happy communicating with people within the structure of my Substack or public platforms and so on. Yeah. But my phone number is it's my private information.
I get the sense that it's about trying to set this up. It's my personal opinion, but whether it's that or whatever it is, to kind of get us in a position where the rational justification can be made that from their perspective that there's a problem, violation of some kind. I got it with the last time I was using the donation overlap, and they tried to actually push me off the platform. And it's a long story, but ultimately, I think it was the CEO of Substack, weirdly enough, that actually spoke up because they use Stripe and was like, basically made the same case I was. And I just got lucky that I was in that same problem at the same time. And we sort of got grandfathered in with this one thing. I tried to start Ko-fi, which was a new platform using a new thing. And it pushed back saying I was doing the wrong. Long story short, I think that what they're trying to do is, make it smaller and smaller for people like us to be able to try to make a return on what we're doing, and that's part of where this goes. And to the point about the Child Safety Act, which you bring up, it's, first of all, it's the argument that that's what they care about. You can prove that's not what their intention are by their actions. And to make that point, let's get into the Epstein conversation. We'll prove at least from the U.S. perspective, but I think it's the same everywhere, that they clearly do not care about the people that they claim they're trying to protect. And so we can talk about that, unless you have any other comments.
And I mean, I think we kind of ended on that yesterday, that the Online Safety Act, which is claiming to protect children, the law is being brought in by those people that protected Epstein to one degree or another. There's a fantastic documentary made by a British investigative journalist, Sonia Poulton, back in 2018 called The Paedophiles in Parliament. So that's not that long ago. That's 7 years ago. And if you're going to tell me it's changed in the last 7 years, I will tell you that's impossible. Right.
I agree.
And so it's those people that are bringing in these laws. The BBC that is pushing the Online Safety Act protected Jimmy Savile.
Yep, exactly. Exactly.
So if you have any faith that these people are genuinely looking after the safety of children, then you need to actually go and check out who those people are and what their involvement in pedophilia, in child trafficking, in child abduction, and so on actually is. And then it becomes clear that this is just another censorship tool.
Right. And you don't need the tool they just built to be able to protect children, right? That is not about, it's about censoring people under the guise of protecting children, which they failed to do in the first place. And that's historically accurate. But the point is that they build this grandiose thing with the claim of, it's really aimed at anything but you don't need that level of control over speech to be able to do what they're doing, And so this is from the U.S. perspective, but in case you guys don't know or are listening, she's referring to the UK act that we're discussing, but there's similar things happening in the United States as well. It's just it seems to be intensified right now in the UK. is that so right now, in case we haven't seen, right now what happened is they released because of the Transparency Act, but it was exactly what we all expected, highly redacted. And I just want to start with this, as there's Bondi saying, President Trump is leading the most transparent administration in American history, and then gets fact-checked.
You can't
by
read
Twitter.
any of it.
Well, yeah, that too, but then even Twitter's like, that's not correct. And it's just funny how it's like the Republican Twitter, so clearly they're getting it from every possible angle right now. And Jason Bassler's highlighting how it's just the most ridiculous cover-up of all time. Everything they're doing is being called out. All this will be included, but just to make it quick, there are redacted photos that we already had public of Donald Trump. Like very clearly showing you that they simply removed pictures of Donald Trump, even though we already had them public. There is one example where they redacted Guthrie, who was actually publicly known. Her image was already out. The image right there was already public, but they redacted it this time. Trying to make it look like they're protecting victims. And even worse, this is beyond the pale. So Donald Trump's administration redacted his name everywhere they could. That's been proven pretty clearly. And on top of that, in their effort to only cover up for their friends, they actually accidentally released, or who knows, maybe on purpose, one of the very people they claim they were protecting, one of the victims. So the whole narrative was we're trying to protect the victims' names. We can't release everything. And then they release information with one of their names in it while redacting. The point was just how obvious this is. And yet here they are acting like, oh, these are old redactions that were there when we got them, and you can prove that's a lie. So they're completely drowning in this lie right now. But I thought that was a good discussion to have, as we briefly talked about before, because the Epstein conversation, the sexual blackmail network, and the U.S. government and everybody else around covering it up very much relate to what we're going to get into. So I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, the Online Safety Act, sorry, it is UK based, but I know from various people in the US that it's now being brought in the US. Exactly. And it's very strong in Australia, interestingly, because it's even Substack have put a statement out on the Substack website saying, like, we are applying the legislation from Australia and the UK.
Really quickly, I forgot about this from the censorship point. Also, Elon Musk and Twitter have 100% comply. I mean, their information came out a long time ago. They complied with over 80% of government censorship requests. And then they were a major part of GARM while it was happening, and they tried to hide that. I mean, it's very clear that they've been actively, willing to censor. And this is what's funny. This is this post here was something that I put up earlier. Senator Eric Schmidt says, foreign governments are building a global censorship industrial complex to crush freedom of speech online. Now they're trying to force social media companies, and I reached out to Elon Musk. So I simply replied by saying, you mean aside from the countless ways both Elon and the U.S. government are already doing so, and in collaboration with a foreign government? So it's like they're clearly absolutely doing the same thing, but it's just, the overlap to the censorship part is that it's already in conjunction with the foreign governments. Anyway, I just want to include that for the censorship part.
But
please.
That's, it's also the irony of the Online Safety Act, right? When they're abusing children in multiple ways, whether it's through mass vaccination as a baby, whether it's the education system, which is grooming kids for pedophiles. I don't know how it is in the US, but in the UK, they're introducing early learning in masturbation, in accepting gay relationships. So, you have this interference in children's education, this grooming strategy effectively through the education system. But what is even more dangerous for me is the disconnect from the family. So you're finding now that families have very little say in what's happening to the child at school, whether it's the vaccine programs, whether it is programming them for incoming terrorist threat, alien invasions, whatever it is. The parents have very little say in this. So their children are literally being traumatized in a school environment, and then being groomed for presumably these pedophile networks, or being introduced to, this entire transgender complex, which is now basically hijacking a child's development, which is perfectly natural for a child to kind of, I'm not even sure as a child I understood my sexuality, but I would have a crush on the head girl at my all-girls school, for example, which is perfectly natural. It's a perfectly natural part of your development as a child going into teenagerhood, etc. But now, of course, that would be seized upon, and the kid would be on puberty blockers. Right. It would be, you would be basically designated gay or transgender and so on. And that entire movement is being encouraged among children rather than just giving them the freedom to develop in their own way. And I think that is kind of terrifying for me. And then they're talking about online safety, when the attack on children is in the actual establishments that should be keeping them safe.
Well, this is the same in the U.S. in regard to the, welfare, like the child protective services, for example, and there's different names for different states, but there's been many studies that I've seen from these groups, them include like the government themselves, pointing out that it's like a pipeline to human trafficking, and that's not even to say that it's intentional. I do think that there's weaponized and sinister people involved, but it's just because of the people that gravitate towards them and abuse. And the larger point is just clearly that these people, I do think it's sort of weaponizing or engineering this in a certain way, but just that they don't care about what they claim to, And I think that this is such a larger conversation about how it overlaps with what they're really, what do you think they're really trying to accomplish in that point? Like, because I tend to look at this like from a U.S. perspective and like foreign policy. I don't believe at the end of the day that the power structure truly cares about woke ideas and pronouns, and it's a means to an end for different agendas. That's how I look at it. There's people within it that buy into it, definitely. So it is a real problem. That's clear. But what do you think, if, in your opinion, the agenda is behind it? Is it just what it looks like, or is there more there?
No, of course there's more there. First of all, it creates division. It's another diversion tactic. In my opinion, if we're talking about the transgender movement and how it's being weaponized, and I don't have anything against people who are genuinely transgender. Right. What I'm always against is the weaponization of movements, whether it's the climate movement, whether, it doesn't matter what movement it is, but when it's hijacked, infiltrated, and weaponized, then it becomes very far removed from what it should represent. Right. And so I think a lot of these movements are created to divide, because, of course, there's a pushback, particularly from those who really want to defend women's rights, because the transgender movement or the transgender legislation is impacting on women's rights in particular. Yeah. Right. So that's number one. And I think it is all about manipulation and control again. Right. From a young age, children are being effectively programmed, indoctrinated, and pushed down a certain path that then becomes normalized for them. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the normality of their life is basically disintegrated.
Well, it also, and absolutely agree with everything you said, but it also creates an extreme dependency on the government. And that's like whether it's the drugs they need to not die. Yeah. Like, and I shouldn't say it so extreme, but that really is, my audience is very familiar. I've gone through this so extensively when this was really on the hot, and what they were behind and what they were doing and what the reality of the drugs were. And that at the highest level of the conversation that they knew that at the hospitals, and people that work there were telling you that, it's just such a gross discussion. But the larger point that this came up for was the idea that these people don't actually care about what they claim they do, So let's bring this over to the larger point of the foreign policy conversation, because I really do think that, these are specific to our locations, but clearly it's not unique to one place. There is a larger, I've even had conversations about, and maybe you could tell me what you think about this, the transhuman direction, and how this very much is a part of that. And that's not an opinion. There are people that are avidly driving that, who are funding things like this.
Yeah, and assisted dying. The assisted dying bills that are coming in, particularly in Canada, although there was a major pushback against it, and I think it's kind of backpedaled a little bit. But in the UK, it's definitely being fast-tracked through. And I mean, I wrote quite a long article about this, looking into the assisted dying bill in Canada and how effectively this is eugenics. Oh yeah. This is the depressed, the elderly, the homeless are going to be offered a fast track off this planet.
There were people in the UK during COVID for dyslexia that were offered that. I remember I covered that many things. I'm sure you know about that. It's like that there's no way of hiding that is eugenics to a T, right? There shouldn't be, the idea that you have a deficiency and shouldn't be around. It's overwhelming.
And
you know, so
actually,
the
because if we
okay.
go on, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
No, I'm saying if we want to actually, I know you mentioned you wanted to talk about it, but that actually ties into the eugenics aspect and how there's overlap with the Zionist ideology, which from the very beginning was triaging the Jews who would be allowed to go to Palestine. So they didn't want any disabled, they didn't want the elderly, they didn't want the poor or the sick. They wanted the elite, basically.
Right.
So the master race
And
that
there
would
were sorry.
go on that,
No,
that
there's a
would
delay,
take
I'm
over
sorry.
Palestine and then you know, build this Zionist empire from Palestine outwards, which is what we're now seeing, of course. But this was effectively, and this is an article by Zachary Foster, which I recommend everyone reads. I've published it everywhere because I just think it's so important. The eugenist history of the Zionist movement, and a lot of people don't understand that it wasn't, you know, that they weren't providing a homeland for the persecuted Jews. They were providing a settlement program for the elite within the Jewish community.
And
Right?
more than that,
and
though, right?
certainly
Too,
the
because it was
Zionist community to a degree.
right. Well, because I mean, there was very much Jewish supremacy involved in it, but it was clearly more than that. Like the Herzl overlap and his own journal with their anti-Semitic comments. Like it's clear. Like if you get Zachary actually was one of the when I interviewed him, opened my mind much more to this very point about you know, the reality of how that started. And for example, that there were, like you just mentioned, there's UN documents that show that the Zionist movement didn't want specific Jews from Europe. You know, and like you just said, it was cultivating this kind of nationalist, you know, what's the term they used? But the point was that they aligned themselves with Nazi Germany, which it blows my mind how easy to prove that is. And yet it's so, it's like the hardest thing to get in the conversation for obvious reasons, but that they aligned themselves, as Dan Cohen points out, even during the final solution or with Stalin, because they wanted this kind of, you know, authoritarian government structure, you know, and so it's clear that this was a construct. You know, and so it's important to understand that. And the eugenicist movement obviously ties into the larger point of the Nazi connection, or really where it started with, which is the United States. So it's interesting to see how this all kind of falls together.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
But exactly. And I mean,
sorry.
you know, you're talking about the Nazi overlap. Also look at Ukraine, which of course is also connected to the modern day. But the connection between Jabotinsky, one of the founders of the revisionist Zionist branch, which is the one that Netanyahu follows, which believes in complete domination and expulsion of the indigenous peoples of the land where they are settling, whether, of course, that is now Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Cyprus, and further afield. We'll come on to that with the Zionist expansion, right? And then going forward, that basically the connection between Israel and Ukraine, the fact that Kolomoisky, who founded the Chabad or Chabad Lubavitch movement in Ukraine, but also funds. So Chabad Lubavitch is, if you like, the equivalent to US aid for the CIA. So it works in the same way as US aid for the Zionist movement. It's their outreach agent. It has over, I think, 5,000 emissaries globally. And it infiltrates education, religion, faith. You know, it's responsible for effectively fostering Christian Zionism, which is an oxymoron in its own right. It's inherently against Christianity. It's inherently against Russia, which is kind of interesting because if we look at Zaharova's statement on the Bondi Beach event, she talks about a terrorist attack which included compatriots of Russia. Well, if she's talking about Chabad Lubavitch, she's talking about enemies of Russia, effectively. I mean, they still talk about the refugees who left Russia in the 70s onwards and came to the occupied territories of Palestine as being refugees from the brutality of the Soviets. So they still are pushing this anti-Russian, anti-Christian, of course, anti-Muslim line, they are effectively genocidal. They're part of the genocidal eugenicist complex.
Yeah.
And even that Chabad chapter in Bondi had been raising money for the IOF, for the Israeli occupation forces. Rabbi Eli Schlanger, who was one of those killed. And, I don't want anybody to get killed, but at the same time, he should have been in The Hague before he was allowed to be on Bondi Beach at Hanukkah.
Absolutely. And we can touch on that.
Should have been, to be honest, but because they had been supporting genocide actively.
Right. Well, the overlap of
7th.
Chabad Lubavitch on that event is not really discussed, right? They try to make it about just a bunch of Jewish people celebrating and it wasn't. There was more to that, but there was some of that too. But we can get into the Bondi Beach overlap too, because I think there's a lot of overlap there. Yesterday, I was planning to get to it to overlap with the shooting conversation. To all scattered with the technological issues, but we can touch on it if we'd like. It's very important. But before we get past it, you bring up Kolomoisky, and I think this is to what we were kind of highlighting there. He ran the 1+1 news station, which was also the news station which Zelensky worked at. And also, I'm sure Zelensky, the entire team that worked with him ended up becoming his cabinet and his government, which is like cartoonishly stupid, but it's still the reality, right? And then he was also at the head of the World Jewish Congress. He's also the chief financier of the Azov movement, at least at one point in time. So it's like this very obvious overlap to so basically, as we highlighted during the height, at least in my coverage of the Azov movement discussion, I'll include some of these articles, that ultimately this is something that had gone back to as the CIA document showing that they were cultivating a fascist entity in Ukraine, as well as the fact that the Azov movement was tied to Charlottesville and the group that marched through Charlottesville that started a lot of this conversation. The Jews will not replace us. That was a proven chapter of the Azov movement representing the United States. So you can tie these tendrils back to Israel and the CIA and the United States government. So it's like, because the reason I'm really trying to reiterate this is what we'll get into is like there's a very large psychological operation like transition taking place right now, and these are parts I think that connect back to these moments that have built to where we are right now. And so it's important to see how that all plays to what you were saying,
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Do you have any thoughts on the Ukraine tie-in to all of it? Because there's the Syria, a part of it, and how arguments anyway, that Syria was sort of the more of an effort to get Russia distracted, I guess, was one thing we've discussed in the past. But what do you think the Ukraine-Israel involvement is? We've touched also on like the Zion discussion, like the future Israel and Ukraine. What are your thoughts today? Has that evolved at all?
Yeah, Odessa. And the fact that actually, Zionism was actually birthed in what was formerly part of the Russian Empire. It wasn't Ukraine back then when Zionism was born. And I did see a Russian academic in an interview the other day actually saying that a huge number of the early Zionists were Russian Jews. So they were Russians, right? Which kind of, fast forward to today, helps us to understand why Russia has such a strong relationship with Israel, despite the fact that Israel is effectively supporting the Azov brigades, which again, we're coming back to this collaboration between Zionism and Nazism, which originally in Ukraine was created between Simon Petlura, the first president of the independent Ukrainian Republic, and Jabotinsky, on the basis that Petlura would allow Jabotinsky to create a Jewish militia, but on the basis that they would unite against the common threat of Russia or the Soviet Union. Right. And so it's kind of interesting that we now see Israel embedded in Ukraine. They were there in the Maidan in 2014. There were actual Zionist brigades working alongside the kind of neo-Nazi brigades. And even now, Israel is supporting Ukraine. And what is even more kind of interesting for me, and this is where I think it's very difficult to understand Russia's policy, because Lavrov has made statements, I think it was Lavrov, who said, we should be moving faster against Ukraine, and we should actually bear in mind, or he compared the war against Hamas to the war against the Nazis in Ukraine, which is an extraordinary comparison to make. Other commentators in Russia have kind of said we should follow the Zionist example, the Israeli example, in how they're dealing with the terrorists in Gaza, and we should be doing the same in Ukraine. But at the same time, in the year before Syria fell, Ukraine was in Idlib providing training and technology and drone technology in particular to Jolani. And it was, if you like, the drone warfare that was very, very effective when Jolani led the attack against Aleppo and then advanced to Damascus in kind of record fast time. The Syrian Arab army were getting pounded by drones. So clearly Ukraine had been instrumental in both providing the drones, the technology, the ability for Jolani and his militia to produce the drones, which were then later on used effectively against what was supposedly a Russian ally. So, this is where it becomes very complicated and very difficult to, and at the same time, Russia inside Syria, and this is all documented, was effectively collaborating at times with the US, but particularly with Israel, and giving promises, particularly to Netanyahu. Putin was giving promises and assurances to Netanyahu that Russia would ensure the security of Israel and would stand down when Israel was targeting Iranian and resistance factions in Syria, which is exactly what they did. Russia did nothing.
Right. I mean, it's such an interesting overlap, right? And this is a perfect segue to get to the larger conversation that I wanted to flesh out more, which, it's actually a really great, the way you frame that's really important for where this is, because, so right now we just talked about the obviousness of the, Nazi or whatever you want to call it, the extremist Azov movement and the funding, or rather support and funding through Israel, which doesn't make sense to people who buy the narrative, but simultaneously they're over here funding and working with the same, whether some of them are actually Muslim adherent or not, Muslim terrorists. It just shows you that this is the crux of what I'm always trying to highlight about Zionism. It's not about the Jewish religion or any religion. It's about using all of it to achieve their ends. And there are people within it that do it here one way or the other. There's also atheist Zionists that are very prominent in the movement, which makes no sense unless you understand what it's really about. So I wanted to talk about the ISIS part of this, because we can get to an article you put out about the weaponization, or rather, the focus of the Muslim culture, and it's being weaponized and attacked, and how interesting that is, and what might all be about. But to start with the history of this connection. So let's get into how far back you want to go to this very clear culmination point of Trump literally shaking the hands with Hayat al-Sham, is the reality that ISIS is what I would call it, a proxy of the U.S. and Israel and other powers that has been, it's changed over the years, but it's something that they've created, funded, worked with, supported medical treatment from Israel and so on. So go anywhere you like with that. I just want people to really understand how clear that is today, and it shouldn't be dismissed.
Yeah, I mean, I did actually publish at my Substack, which I had taken from a previous article, but I'd refreshed it and added new links. Someone had done a timeline based on links in mainstream media, Israeli media, spanning, I think it was around, might be 10 years, of the US involvement with ISIS effectively, and how it was very obviously a construct that was both, I think it was a way back. I can't remember what it's called, the ISIS timeline, something like that.
There's mine right there. And I'll make sure to include it afterwards so they can check it out. Oh, this as well.
It's interesting because it gives a lot of the history of ISIS and how deeply connected it is to US deep state, to the Pentagon, to the US State Department. And I don't know if people remember, I think it was around 2016, Obama tried to rebrand ISIS into Khorasan. I don't know if you remember that. And it was all very confusing for people on the ground, including myself at the time, because it was like, where on earth did this name come from? And then it kind of disappeared again because it obviously didn't really work. And people weren't really kind of, it wasn't going to gather traction. So it was sort of disappeared and shelved, and ISIS remained, or Daesh as it was known, locally in Syria.
But at that point in time, I wasn't really as immersed now, but I think I remember that, as well as the moment when, which they act like it's not real, but the video of Obama literally saying we worked with ISIL forces. That is a real video.
Oh, no, that was Kerry. That was Kerry. That was Kerry at a UN closed session.
No. There's a clip of Obama for sure saying that. I can pull it up, but it's okay.
But there is also John Kerry in a closed session, which was, I think, originally published by the New York Times, and he was speaking with so-called revolutionary Syrian activists in the white helmets, and he was saying they allowed ISIS to flourish because they thought they would be successful in overthrowing the Syrian government.
Let me see if I can pull this up. Keep going. I'll pull up this video if I can. I'm familiar with streaming Zoom.
But it's also for people to understand also, because this is where it kind of gets confusing, because while the Zionists weaponize the extremist Wahhabi doctrine to target all Muslims as the enemies of Jews and the enemies of civilization, as Netanyahu is always telling you, in fact, Israel has weaponized ISIS. And I think there was a statement again around 2013 from Michael Oren saying that they would rather have ISIS in power, and paraphrasing, in Syria than President Assad.
I remember that too.
Yeah. And also, I mean, we do have to remember, when has ISIS ever really attacked US military or Israel? And we mentioned in the last conversation that in 2017, ISIS attacked Israel and then apologized for making a mistake. So in other words, it's very clear that there is not a close relationship, but there is a subordinate manager relationship between Israel and ISIS to a degree. Of course, as we said, there are elements that are not going to come under that umbrella and who are potentially going to be of risk to Israel. But, that's inevitable. If you're going to play with terrorism, at some point, it's going to come back and bite you.
Yeah.
And what is interesting for me is if we look at now what Israel is doing in Gaza, and even prior to the Trump peace scam, where, of course, Israel has now occupied 58% of Gaza territory. And it's the territory, by the way, which is the most abundant from an agricultural resource perspective. And they've pushed 2 million Palestinians into a slither of land that is right on the beach. And if we're talking about terror on the beach, let's talk about the daily massacres of Palestinians on the beach in Gaza, which has been ongoing for 100 years, didn't begin on the 7th of October. And nobody, this is the hierarchization of victimhood, which is what they do every time. They've kind of lost the narrative on anti-Semitism. They've lost the whole Holocaust narrative because they've been committing a Holocaust, a very visible, a very live streamed, a very potent Holocaust since the 7th of October. So they're desperately trying to claw back that public opinion deterrence that they had. Yeah. Right. And in my opinion, this is part of what the Bondi Beach is being exploited to do. Even if it wasn't a false flag, it's definitely being exploited to bring in crackdowns on protests, because this is what brought about this event. This is what ended up with the massacre of Jews in Bondi, etc. Netanyahu's gone out there saying all this. Right. And Rabbi Eli Schlanger, who was one of those killed in the Bondi Beach incident, he had actually written, when you talk about the weaponization of religion, he had written to Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, basically putting pressure, because Australia had recognized the state of Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big no-no. And that's another reason, in my opinion, that this attack happened, was to pressurize Australia into rescinding that recognition. Because Schlanger had written to Albanese and said to him, you know, this is apostasy, what you're doing, recognizing the state of Palestine. It goes against Christian values. It goes against civilizational values. I mean, it's just amazing.
Let me play this. Let me play this clip really quickly since I gathered it up, and then let's overlap this with the, you know, because there's a lot of ways we could overlap this conversation. And I think it's really interesting. So what I'm going to play, since I have it up, is him saying this, but the overlap to like the ISIS-linked gangs they're working with in Gaza, to the, you know, the obvious point,
exactly,
and then the larger conversation that dovetails with your article about the weaponization of this, and sort of like what I'm worried about is the immigration manipulation, and, you know, that interestingly a very real worry that's kind of framed the opposite way of people being in this country that are acting, you know, in some kind of secret way. And that's a valid point to be made. I'm worried about this being something that is more about the forces we're highlighting here and then using them to be blamed on something else. It's kind of a general point, and we can get into the evidence around it. But here, just again, since we have it up, is Obama saying this from the past.
As I've said before, this aspect of our strategy was moving too slowly, but the fall of Ramadi has galvanized the Iraqi government. So with the additional steps I ordered last month, we're speeding up training of ISIL forces, including volunteers from Sunni tribes in Anbar province. Which
is very provable and real, you know.
Actually,
you get when you talk about it. Good.
That's interesting. I don't think I've seen this clip, but I'm not sure he meant to say ISIL forces. I don't know that.
But I think good.
Yeah, that's a major, I don't know. That seems to me to be a major slip up, because if you remember, it was his train and equip program, the whole Timber Sycamore operation, which was funding 500 so-called moderate rebels. Of course, Ramadi is in Iraq, but it seems odd to me that he would admit that it was ISIL.
Right.
That's very strange.
One of the arguments was that he misspoke. And then the other argument, even though I found the original video, is that it was an altered video. And so it's interesting nonetheless, because you can prove that is in fact what's going on. So I think it was more of a mistake he made, you know?
It was more of a slip up, I think, because that was because Kerry was a bit more circumspect. But even so, he said, no, very clearly we allowed them to flourish. And don't forget, when they were in Ramadi, they traveled, 500 kilometers to Raqqa under US surveillance. And the entire convoy was not bombed. I remember that very early on.
Right. And I brought up the article for the podcast, you know, ISIS fighters regret attacking Israel. There's so much of this that it blows my mind, you know, but then this was the point to overlap it as well, is that, you know, the supposed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is provably, even according to Haaretz and statements made within the Knesset, ISIS-linked Gaza militias. And he goes, what's wrong with that? You know, they openly discuss this in the Knesset. And so all these things are just so damn clear, you know, that there's so much connection to this. But so let me bring this to this point, and we can finish on this larger point. Well, did you want to talk about the Bondi Beach discussion at all? Maybe we can overlap with it.
No, I mean, I think we've sort of covered it, because I think it ties into all of this. And what's interesting is what you said about, because I was going to mention that the use of the weaponization of ISIS elements in Gaza to effectively fight back against Hamas, right? And that's exactly what they've done in Syria. And of course, they did it in Afghanistan. They've done it globally now.
Right.
And now we're seeing it rolled out. ISIS is operating. It never really stopped operating in Iraq. But of course, the US were effectively transporting them from the so-called holding prisons in northeast Syria into Iraq, training them, re-equipping them, and then either sending them back into Syria or getting them to carry out operations like, for example, against electricity infrastructure in Iraq. And, you know, Iraq is still in danger of the ISIS effect, let's say. And in my opinion, it could in the future be used in any of the countries neighboring Israel, including Turkey, including Egypt.
Right.
This is just my opinion because I think Egypt is going to be targeted fairly soon. Because the thing is, what Israel doesn't want, what's the first thing it did when Syria fell? And I was still in Syria when Israel started bombing because there was no air defense. So they effectively destroyed all of Syria's military capability in the first 48 hours of Sholani arriving in Damascus. What Israel doesn't want is any country in the region, whether it is currently an ally, whether it is currently normalized with Israel, like the UAE is, for example, Saudi Arabia is, just not officially. Egypt is normalized from the 79 Camp David Accords. But it doesn't want any of these countries to have a standing military.
Right.
Or to have air defenses, or to have the capability of defending itself against Israel at any time in the future. If you look at the Lebanon model, the US sponsors the Lebanese armed forces, but it sponsors it to the extent where it's not capable of defending the country against Israel because the weapons that it receives, I think it has 2 Cessna planes. That's all it's ever been supplied with. And I remember it being Said Nasrallah's funeral when the 4 Israeli jets that apparently, according to Israel, were the ones that actually assassinated Said Nasrallah, buzzed us overhead while we were at the funeral twice. And I think it was on the second one, we could see the Lebanese Cessna plane, which had also obviously been just keeping an eye on what was happening, literally bobbing around in the wake of the 4 Israeli jets. And that, for me, was symbolic of exactly what the US has done in Lebanon. And effectively, that's what they want to do with all the neighboring countries, whether, as I said, they are now in alliance with Israel or not. Doesn't matter. The military has to be decimated to a point where it is never going to raise any kind of threat or risk to Israel in the future.
So it can be
exploited. So I think, ISIS is a useful instrument, very much connected to both the Israeli intelligence agencies and the US intelligence agencies, more than Turkey. Turkey is more connected, like Qatar is, to the Muslim Brotherhood, the Free Syrian Army, it would have been originally in Syria.
And with the designation from Trump, it opens the door to them, to using that excuse to focus on, Palestinian groups in the United States, for example, which is another part of this.
Yeah, well, they've stopped giving visas out to Palestinians now in the last couple of days. Trump has brought in new restrictions on visas from Palestine. And when Damascus fell, of course, what did Europe do? Having opened their borders, and we should actually touch on the migration issue because it's incredibly important.
That was what I was going to go to next.
Europe,
we can get into that.
Yeah, Europe opened its borders to many of what were the extremist factions to come to Europe and establish Takfiri enclaves for example, in Berlin, in Sweden, in the UK, in France, and so on. They're everywhere in Europe. And of course, what we're now seeing, in my opinion, is a kind of partnership between US and Russia. If people look at the messaging from Kirill Dmitriev, who is effectively the Stephen Witkoff of President Putin, if you go and just go and read his X feed, it's kind of fascinating because he's amplifying the white nationalist figures like Tel Aviv, Tommy Robinson, as we call him, because he's funded by the Zionists to effectively lead these kind of Islamophobic campaigns in the UK. And the problem is, again, there's an element of reality in this, but it's being weaponized to create divide and to create effectively civil war, in my opinion, eventually in Europe and the UK. Now, this benefits both Russia and the US, right? Because the US wants to get out. Trump certainly wants out of NATO. They want a weak EU that's reliant on US LNG and so on. Russia also wants a weak Europe because right now Europe and the UK are the ones still maintaining the pressure on the Ukraine war and still talking about, although Japan is stepping in also now, I noticed the other day, maintaining the weaponization of the Nazis in Ukraine against Russia. Right. So it's in Russia's interest also to have a weakened EU from the perspective of an economic weakening, which of course is also part of why they're reclaiming the 230 billion from the EU right now. Trump is suing the BBC for 10 billion. All of this is having an economic knock-on effect on countries that have already basically bankrupt themselves by supporting the war against Russia and Ukraine.
It's interesting, I just watched a recent documentary, and similar thoughts before I saw this about the I think an Al Jazeera documentary around the funding around a lot of that, Tommy included, from tech right like Peter Thiel, for example, and really driving. And I should make the point that I'm very much, I think I'm against government. I don't think government should exist, but that's quite far down the road for most people. But that I don't like the EU in general. I think that it's a globalist kind of direction. It's kind of supersedes a lot of power from the actual locations themselves. But that being said, and I agree. I think that's a static point. Is that it's the point I'm saying that because people are pointing at what we're discussing as if we're protecting the EU. And it's like, that's not the same conversation. There is an element of what, like the Trump circle and what you're saying in the UK seemingly aiming at the EU. But I think it's more so about a transition of power as opposed to fighting the globalist element. And so what you're saying is, or I was pointing out on top of what you're saying, is that the Teal and kind of tech right funding going into these very groups to create the destabilization and anti-Muslim sentiment, which doesn't seem to even really be at large about the actual Muslim conversation, but more so, like you're saying, to use this to create civil war, destabilization. I argue that's about transitioning us using that into what's coming next. What do you think about that?
But also, they've deliberately been bringing in these extremist elements. If I go back to, again, I think it's around 2018 maybe, Sadiq Khan was offering amnesty to British extremists who were fighting alongside Al-Qaeda and other Wahhabi ideologues in Syria. So he's actually offering amnesty to them to come back to the UK within a certain time frame. So he's inviting them back into the UK. And I remember when I was actually detained, one of the officers that was talking to me at one point, I was there for about 6 hours, so it was quite a long conversation, actually told me, he said, but there are terrorists coming in all the time. And when we inform the Home Office, they're like, no, it's fine. And then he said, we let them in and then they go back and bring their entire family. So this is a deliberate fracturing of society by the governments in these countries.
And to point out, though,
and that's what I'm trying to get across, because the same sectarian tactics that were used to destabilize countries in West Asia are now going to be rolled out to destabilize countries in the West. And if people don't figure this out, they're going to fall for it.
Right.
And fall for the Sharia law. We're all going to be under Sharia law, et cetera, et cetera.
Because there's a big difference
when their government is creating this. Yeah.
The big difference between the extreme, and also it's important to always point out, extremism is bad wherever it resides, right? It's like it's a specialized, only the Muslims are, the extremism is bad. And so the point is that they're bringing in extremism. But the argument, which I understand why people fall for this, is the argument then is that Muslim extremism is coming in, like it's not just immigration. There's a big difference between the average refugee and the people that they're choosing to bring in for that very purpose, as I agree with you. And I think I tend to see that as there's a Zionism fingerprints all over that. And it's not just that, though, but the clear overlap. That's what the article I had about the weaponized migration point. So it's really interesting because clearly there is a level of truth to the, military age males and the migration and the so on, but it's not, it ends up being focused by the partisanship on the average people coming through that are being abused by the government action.
Who are also at threat, because if you look at Syria, let's take Syria as an example, the ordinary Muslim were at risk from the extremist so-called Muslims. I don't even consider them to be Muslims. Wahhabism is a perversion of Islam, in my opinion.
And we touched on yesterday Mohammed bin Salman's statements about the fact that they're not religious at the top. Go ahead.
Yes. And it's also the fact, like, for example, when people talk about Sharia law, and it's kind of they manufacture the narrative that Sharia law is some kind of, dark force that's going to be expanded into their countries and they're all going to have to live under Sharia law. Sharia law is exactly like canonical law for the Christians. Right? It can be misinterpreted, it can be misused. It's like the word takfir is part of jurisprudence. But the fact is that the majority of Muslims are not going to use takfir to say, yeah, but you don't agree with me, so you're a kufr, so I can kill you.
Right.
That's not how the majority of Muslims. So it's like a structure within the religion itself, which is then weaponized and distorted by those who are fanatics, just as Christianity was. Right.
But
just
it's also
as Judaism definitely is.
Yes. But it's also good to point out that on top of that, and I'm glad you said that because that's so misrepresented, but I don't want any of those things to be forced on me, regardless of what it is. The point is that I don't think, rather the evidence shows that that's not even happening. The argument gets floated like, we're passing legislation, anti-Sharia law. There's no evidence that there's some mass overtaking of Sharia law in some political or enforcement way. And it would be unconstitutional in the first place. Not that they can't do that when they want to anyway, but it's just not happening the way they claim it is. So it's very important to see both parts of that. And so what's the end point of doing that in your mind? What's the drive for faking Sharia law overtaking the country?
Well, I mean, I think that's just to create the fear factor. It's just to other Islam as a religion and also to sell the narrative that Islam is the enemy of Christianity. And I don't know if you want to bring up Miriam's article, Miriam Sharbati, who's sorry.
Let's end with that. But let me do one thing really quickly, and I want to. This is what I was going to show a second ago. I think this is really relevant. So I'm not familiar with this guy's account or even what his intention is behind it. I get the sense that it's more right leaning, but it's an interesting thought that we're kind of overlapping. So we started with the idea, the obvious, verifiable reality of what ISIS really is, and the factors that claim to fight it, largely the ones supporting, arming, medical treatment, the whole thing, right? And so that's the overlap. So when they're claiming we're invaded by these Muslim terrorists, there's a level of truth that might be within that, but it's clear that these are the people pulling those strings. And so separate from that, we're rather just connected. Here's what he says. Or Patriot Oasis says, Australia, France, and Germany have now all canceled their New Year celebrations. And this gets into the whole, we're about to be attacked by Hamas or Iran or whatever the narrative is, right? They're all coming for us. Alex says, now that they're about to have massive social revolts on their hands, they're about to activate their illegal jihad immigrants so they can crack down. Now, what's interesting to me is from a MAGA or whatever, I guess more of a team sport politics Republican side of it, you're going to argue that that was a insider Muslim invasion and they're ready to react. Well, maybe it's not too far from that, but what we're talking about is the weaponized elements of Zionism and U.S. intelligence that have been released or already here that are going to be weaponized in that way. So it's like, how do you have this conversation with somebody who's like kind of on the same page but only sees it in one side when the evidence clearly points that that's not actually what's going on? I just, what's your thought on that? And let's get into the article and maybe they overlap.
I mean, I've been sort of dealing with this an awful lot. I mean, I live here in this region. So for me, understanding Islam, although I don't consider myself a theologian or anything like that, but I've lived among, in Syria, it's a very secular society. You have Christians, Muslims, all other minorities, all living together, all sharing their beliefs, their ideologies. You used to see more Muslims during the Christmas celebrations than you would see Christians, partly because they outnumber the Christians in Syria. But anyway, you would see both hijabi and non-hijabi not wearing the hijab. Muslims coming to the Christmas celebrations and sharing them, and vice versa. You would see Christians respecting, for example, Ramadan fasting. You would see Christians not eating during the day because they didn't want to offend their Muslim neighbors. This was complete coexistence, right, in Syria until Jolani was introduced and, real sectarianism kicked in or was kicked in. And I think I've slightly forgotten the question. Just tell me again.
Oh, well, I mean, just the general overlapping point. I'm just bringing up the article about the ISIS patch wearing people that rolled out through Syria the moment that they, you can reverse image search it, you'll find that's exactly what it is. But the larger point was simply about the weaponized invasion and how that is a difficult conversation because clearly, go ahead.
No, it is. It is extremely difficult because people get very emotional about it. And I kind of understand that. And to a degree, there is definitely a threat. But for example, there was an incident in the UK very recently where an immigrant from Ethiopia had or was accused of having attacked a young girl. And people were up in arms about the whole immigration situation and issue. But the fact is, he was an Ethiopian Christian, but it was channeled towards this anti-Muslim fervor incorrectly, right? Which is then, so it's almost like now all immigrants have become Muslim and all Muslims have become extremists.
Exactly.
This is how the narrative is being pushed. Yeah. And it was the Zionists who actually created the term Islamist extremist. Even the term jihadi makes me cringe a little bit because jihad is about struggle.
Yes.
And it's
so
a total
misinterpreted.
it's a very disrespectful term for the majority of moderate. I don't even like to say moderate because I'm not here to defend Islam.
Right. It's the same.
Muslims defend themselves. It's not my place to defend it, but it is my place to say, please don't get pulled down this path of targeting all Muslims because of the narratives you're being fed by effectively originating with the Zionists and then being amplified by the media outlets, by even UN agencies, by commentators, by analysts, by nationalists, and so on. Because before long, you're going to turn against a huge sector of your society.
And that's the point. I think it's, so you're it's like, just like during COVID or any other large influence, it's about making you doubt your neighbor, right? So nothing is sacred. Everyone's against you. It's say something on a mass scale. It's what we're talking about, but also the word intifada. I've done this point so many times, and it even seems to frustrate people in my audience that I otherwise, it's just the meaning of the word. So I can go out and say, I'm going to carry out a revolution, and that could involve in my mind the execution of everybody involved. They can call it a terrorist attack. You can call it the American intifada if you want to, and it would mean the same thing. It's the outcome and the meaning and the intention that makes the difference. These words, like you said, mean struggle, and mostly, we don't have to get into it all, but there's the meaning behind it in mostly around a religious sense, like struggling with your adherence to what you believe God wants from you. It's just such a frustrating thing. But the point is clearly to make it out to be the other, the dehumanization, to use it in this large scale point. But back to what I was saying, the first point is that it's so difficult to reach somebody who has, one, been convinced that every Muslim is a terrorist, because clearly the U.S. government, left and right, has been driving that narrative for a very long time. But then to go, they exist, right? Clearly there's extremism, and maybe you're even right about some of them being used and weaponized here, but you're pointing at the wrong country. You're pointing at the wrong power structure. It's a very difficult thing, and it's also nuanced. I'm not going to say that I know for sure that there's not a Muslim government out there, or rather a Muslim country with the government that runs it that is trying to infiltrate this country. The point is, it's not about the larger, it's about the individual case. Like you said about the Ethiopian, like, does that make it every Ethiopian a problem? No, it means that he did something, if that's really what happened. But it gets broadly taken out of context. And so I'll bring up this article, and let's just kind of end with the larger discussion about how this is being weaponized, right? And, my mind goes to a lot of different directions about the technocratic globalist discussion of it as well, but just this large kind of sprawling, right now the Zionist entity is invading Lebanon, Syria, God, all these different expansion parts of the greater Israel discussion in Ukraine and so on. And so, where you see it going, and the point was the use of the other, the weaponization of, this is the article here, the very religion or people itself, to argue that they're the enemy to justify it all, which is not the case. So start where you like.
Yeah, this isn't actually written by me. This is written by a very good friend of mine, Miriam Sharabati, who is Maronite Christian, but very supportive of the Islamic resistance Hezbollah in Lebanon and globally, actually. So in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, Yemen, and so on, resistance against Zionist occupation of Palestine, but also more largely against colonialism, settler colonialism, and disrespect of sovereignty, right? Mm. And she writes, I do recommend reading this because it comes from the perspective of a Christian who was born and is living here. She has spent some time in Canada, so she has also kind of a perspective that comes from outside of Lebanon. And it's been a journey for her to kind of rediscover her roots and discover that even in the early days, as she tells me, you know, the kind of crossover between Islam and Christianity, where people were converting from Christianity to Islam in this region, it was quite common, right? Mm-hmm. And from my perspective, in support of what she's writing, when I was in Syria from 2016, and I spent a lot of time with the Syrian Christian communities, particularly in northern Hama, which is on the border with Idlib. So they were on a daily basis under attack from the extremist Takfiri Wahhabi groups, mm-hmm. like Al-Qaeda or ISIS or the various branches and affiliates, who were very much at certain points reliant upon the support of Hezbollah. Like literally, Hezbollah saved a number of Syrian Christian communities and villages. Not only that, in 2016, in a Christian town on the border it's in Lebanon, on the border with Syria, that was attacked by Syrian extremist refugees who carried out a number of suicide bombings, both in the morning and the afternoon in the town, which has, I think, only something like 3,000 inhabitants. And there was something like 5,000 refugees on their doorstep, like literally 200 meters away from them. And this Lebanese Christian community are actually opposed to Hezbollah and to the resistance. Because Lebanon is a very complex sectarian country. Right. Since the Taif Agreement in 1989. It's been kept in this sectarian environment. It's very disjointed as a country. It's not how Syria was pre-December 2024.
Really quickly, to your point.
And so
before,
even though this Christian...
Go ahead.
Sorry.
There's a delay. I'm sorry. I just trying to jump in really quickly. Go ahead. Please finish.
No, so even though this Lebanese Christian town is opposed to the resistance, it was the resistance that came and defended them quietly against the threat from the ISIS extremist elements within the refugees that had left Syria and come to Lebanon and were being supported by the kind of pro-regime change in Syria groups in Lebanon.
I was going to add that, you know, to your point earlier, that whether Syria or Lebanon, right, what you're discussing about what they're trying to accomplish in these places is that evidence there, right? You keep them destabilized, you keep them lacking for defense. They're easily manipulated and exploited as long as you want going forward. You know, it's just worth noting that. And Lebanon is such a great example. And how Hezbollah has developed is a growing popular resistance to that very obvious understanding from a lot of people in Lebanon. And that gets framed as a terrorist group because they're fighting that kind of power. You know, it's how it goes.
Yeah, I always say, like, why is it a proscribed group in the US and the UK when it's absolutely no threat to the security of the US and the UK? It's a threat to the so-called security of Israel that is destroying the security of the region on behalf of the US and the UK.
You answered the question right there, because it's, I argue right now that U.S. interests are Israeli interests. Now, you can look at that whichever way you want. I have an opinion, but I think it's very clear that those are the same thing right now. I think I'm of the mind that it's very clear that policy is not under the control of the administration, or at the very least that their interests are completely what Zionism wants for the world. And this is not Trump or only. It goes back a long way. And that's kind of larger concern about all of this, is that I think that what's happening on a global scale, whether we're talking about the technological developments or just the, foreign policy or the larger globalist kind of overlap of all of it, is that right now in this country, we can see that there is, talking about like the startup nation point, Israeli companies that are very outspokenly, openly discussing that they're acting in the interest of Israeli intelligence, right? And these are things that are connected to infrastructure, dams, water, 911 call centers, and that we just saw with the pager attack in Lebanon, like how this
Education,
might play out. And with what we just discussed, that a lot of people in this country would immediately point to whatever the U.S. government pointed to, Iran, whatever else. And that's a very concerning development.
Yeah, and if you look at the Yossi Cohen interview where he basically said all mobile phones globally have the potential to be a weapon in our hands, basically. I'm paraphrasing
since you say
again,
Since you say that, let's bring this up. And I've played these many times. My audience is probably going to roll their eyes. Oh, that video again. it's worth watching because of the point you made. And so let's play that one, and then in conjunction with the one of the interview they did after the pager attack. I think this is very relevant.
Did you see any surprises in Gaza?
Surprises?
Yeah.
Like the intelligence surprises.
Pages, walkie-talkies. Do you know how many treated equipment do we have in these countries? You don't. I do.
You mean booby-trapped equipment?
Not only booby-trapped.
And spying.
Manipulated equipment. All right?
In which countries are you talking about?
All the countries that you can imagine.
That's wild. Right. And then on the back of that, we've got this clip.
It's said so casually as well. It's just like...
This is the one from after the pager attack. And you can't know people trying to push back on this. Just so it's clear, this was set up by the Israeli government. The Israeli government promoted this interview. So whether they're lying about it is a different conversation, but they're stressing the idea that this is what they're capable of.
How did you convince Hezbollah to buy this?
Well, obviously, they didn't know that they were buying it from Israel.
Who did they buy it from, or think they were buying it from?
We have an incredible array of possibilities of creating foreign companies that have no way being traced back to Israel, shell companies over shell companies who affect the supply chain to our favor. We create a pretend world. We are a global production company. We write the screenplay. We're the directors. We're the producers. We're the main actors. The world is our stage.
Wow. So if people haven't seen that, that's shocking. And when I first, I think it was Kevork who shared that's the first one we played. When I first saw it, I was like, this is exactly what I've been talking about. The threat almost or Netanyahu standing in front of 250 U.S. congressmen and women at the 50 States One Israel conference. And he says very abruptly, by the way, I might even have the clip about weapon systems, and goes, do you guys have a phone? You got a piece of Israel in your pocket. And then just goes on to some other point. I'm like, where did that even come from? I genuinely believe that was a threat. The idea of going, remember that we have this capability. So what are your thoughts about all that?
Yeah, definitely. And giving the golden pager to Trump, which is, this was state terrorism, what was carried out in Lebanon. Yes. Thousands of children, women, civilians mutilated in that attack. I remember being in Damascus, and because of the overload on the hospitals in Lebanon, they were sending patients with eye injuries to Damascus. And I remember speaking to a doctor friend of mine who was in tears. She'd gone through the war and remained completely calm. She was completely broken by it. She said, Vanessa, I had a mother and a daughter come in, and the mother was begging her to take her eyes because, she'd reached the end of her life. She said, take my eyes and give them to my daughter because she shouldn't be in this state. She's young. Right. And another story where a young girl was injured in the pager attack. She wanted to get married. And so they waited for her to heal. She got married fairly recently, and she was injured in the Israeli bombing of the southern Beirut suburbs in the last few weeks. This is the life that people have here. And here is Trump and Netanyahu celebrating it with the Golden Pager Award. It's just, people don't understand how disgusting this is. It's kind of, it's like if someone, we won't get into the whole 9/11 subject, but it's like if someone came and gave you a golden tower collapsing or something like this. It's incredibly, horrifyingly insulting to the people here.
Right.
And it's so tasteless. But that's what it's designed to do. It's designed to basically further intimidate, further humiliate and so on. This is what all of their policies are. There's no policy that is good for development, human development, or human progression, or humanity generally. There's nothing. And when we talk about the Civil War scenario, what is that going to do? It's going to bring in surveillance. It's going to bring in martial law. It's going to bring in greater restrictions and controls and travel controls and so on. You're going to be far more surveilled than you are right now. And right now it's getting out of control. And another thing, just very quickly, if people really want to understand the Zionist infiltration of society, not only in the US, go to the UK 2030 Israel-UK agenda, and you will understand very clearly just by reading that document, I think it's 2 or 3 pages, exactly how Israel, through its various spy units like 8200 and all the various branches of its technology supremacist industry, how it is effectively infiltrating and taking control of the information regarding you as an individual. So Oracle is storing all the information from the British Ministry of Defense, the NHS, the National Health Service. Oracle is Zionist.
Right.
Larry Ellison is a self-declared Zionist. He doesn't allow people to work for the company unless they're pro-Israel.
And you got the Palantir,
the same thing. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yep. Yeah.
And
so it's kind of frightening.
It is. Well, I mean, to step on that, I just thought you had stopped. This delay is killing me today. But the point was that the Palantir additional point to that is that it's the same thing. And you can even very clearly show in more ways than I can count, like barely behind the scenes, the connection between Larry Ellison and Peter Thiel through Trump's administration and through Stargate, through any number of different things. And so I see this as one larger global transition of change. And so the point is back to this discussion of the Gaza smart city, freedom city, network state, whatever we're calling this, it's all the same conversation, the same funding, the same people, all of it. And this is listed as the technocratic, transitional team or whatever they call it, the digital currency, tokenized everything. I mean, this is the Great Reset. This is Freedom City. It's all that we're talking about.
The Gaza model. Yeah,
exactly. Well, that's the point about you said what happens in the Civil War, right? Well, they seize on the excuse to roll out this would be the solution to stopping that from happening. And whatever problem it is, this will be the solution, So this is that transitional concern for me.
And it's total eradication of your history, your heritage, your culture. It's happened in Palestine from pre-1947 onwards. Netanyahu, under the last Trump administration, closed all the archives on the Nakba, on the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 1948.
Most people don't even know that they have a massive campaign of like retroactive censorship of their history and documents. I just think that's important to point out.
And look at what's happening in Syria, perfect example. They're actually eradicating, for example, the days commemorating previous revolutions against French mandate, etc. They've eradicated them. And of course, through the 14-year regime change war, they destroyed many of the symbolic historic sites, like, for example, Palmyra, various places of worship. And now Jolani is destroying many of the old Shia Muslim shrines, Christian churches, which were also being desecrated in Idlib. So history is effectively being eradicated. And right now, of course, there's no independent journalism inside Syria to push back against the rewriting of the narrative and the reaffirming of Assad being the criminal and them being the revolutionaries. It's completely getting all the work that people did for 14 years to push back against the BBC, CNN, Sky News, and all the rest of it is effectively being torn down, right? And so this is what is going to happen. Your existence, your community, your history, your heritage is effectively going to be destroyed so that you're left completely dependent on the state and on the state apparatus, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry, the military industrial complex, the surveillance complex, and so on. You're going to be completely under their control and management. And you're going to lose connection with family, you're going to lose connection with community, and you're going to have your entire history as a human being effectively taken away from you. Exactly what's been happening here.
Yeah, and the overlap with the technological part of it is very clear, right? With the idea of, I mean, 1,000 different directions we can go in, but just specifically the surveillance, the control, I mean, constitutional issues. But what I think is very interesting is from that larger push, I don't know if you know this, but they've referred to it in their own documentation from many of them to tech Zionism. That's what's the network state discussion. That's what many of them are calling this, as the new homeland for our new CEO run company. And this is what Trump's leaning into, so whether they even know this or not, this is the same agenda as I see it. And so it's very concerning, the whole argument, like, you're the next Gaza or after, it's not very far from where we are, and I'll include all my other points around this, that Trump and the Zionist globalist technocrats are building your new society, whether you like it or not. But I just think this is my biggest concern. And then Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff on the 19th says, pitch Project Sunrise plan to turn Gaza into the high-tech metropolis, which would see the U.S. commit to roughly 20% of reconstruction costs. It's already happening. It's in real time. So I guess,
it's planned for southern Lebanon as also, that,
yes,
right?
or you pointed out Syria yesterday, right? With the wall around Syria. I mean, it's like rapidly. This is why I'm so feeling pressure. It's like you've been doing this longer than me, longer than most. I've been doing this long enough to be able to I feel an increase in the pressure in the, their agenda. We felt it during COVID as well. Like it felt suddenly things got really ramped up and things were falling flat. That's happening right now. Trump's administration is falling, the Epstein files, the constitutional issues, like their own base is kind of starting to eat them alive, which shows me that this is kind of a transitional moment in a lot of ways. And I just am very concerned about, I'm not trying to scare anybody, but we really need to understand what this all is and where it goes. So, to kind of end on this, any other thoughts on, what people should be doing, what you see happening and, that overlap and where it goes?
I think for me, the most important thing is consistency. You have to create your own, in a sense, a moral compass. And I think what they're trying to destroy is our ability to be human, our ability to have humanity, our ability to have compassion. If they're creating, and I said this to someone in the UK who was kind of panicking about a mosque being built in her little town. And I said, instead of panicking, go to the mosque and ask to speak to the people that are actually going to be attending the mosque and express your fears and your concerns. Like, create a bridge within your community to that which you fear. Of course, I'm not suggesting you do that if it's a known Takfiri enclave that you might find in Germany, in Sydney, Australia, because someone told me it's easy to get an ISIS flag in Sydney, Australia, because there are Takfiri enclaves there, right? Because these have been created globally, without a doubt, by the kind of Five Eyes global technocrats, as you said, in order to be used as a future tool of destabilization when necessary. But try and create those bridges. Try and not allow that distrust of your neighbor to come in. Because as soon as you do that, it's like with COVID, when people were turning on each other because one person wasn't obeying the rules and the other person was reporting them. No, don't do that. If you have an issue, go and talk to your neighbor and just say, I feel concerned by this. And then have a discussion. You can probably come up with a compromise. But when people allow themselves to be controlled by the central power structure and to respond according to what that central power structure is telling you how you should respond, then you disconnect, you unplug from humanity. And that's the biggest danger. That's what they want us to do. That is exactly what is happening in Syria. For 14 years, the Syrian people maintained their humanity despite some of the most appalling atrocities and campaigns that were being waged against them, including economic pressure, right? As soon as the West got its way and they imposed Jolani, what happens?
Same thing every time.
The entire country has decentralized completely, and people are withdrawn into their communities, into their sects, and they don't even trust their communities.
And rightly
Right.
so, because I mean, historically, every single
Yeah.
time they've seen this, that what they destabilize, they destroy, they exploit. I mean, I've not seen a single country that they supposedly, you know, I don't know what to bring freedom to that ultimately is in any way, even long term benefit, you know, better than it was before. I mean, you can go down the list. So it's just so frustrating. But you know what I was thinking about I think it was even today or yesterday, it just came so strong in my mind. That, you know, which I'm sure historically probably everyone in this always come to this point. It's like I'm thinking out loud. You know, live and let live. Right? I just want to live in peace. I don't want to be. I want to be able to do what I want in my land and just. Like if you know your neighbor's doing something, then do it over there. That's your land. It's like the idea that we have this mindset and we've been turned into the whole see something, say something. Even the Republicans at this point, it's a whole of partisanship idea at this point. It's so alarming to think about how counterintuitive that is to what we all pretend we want when in most of these countries. You know, it's just so frustrating. But if we can get back to that basic idea, you know, that it's about, you know, self-reliance, self-responsibility, it's just but I do think, and let's end maybe on a little bit of a positive note, that, you know, as I've said a lot over the last, even since COVID-19, I see more people pushing back, waking up, calling this stuff out than I've ever seen doing this. You're not going to hear that in corporate media. You're not going to hear that in mainstream alternative media because they're like financially and otherwise invested in keeping the status quo, right? But I really see it. I don't know about you, but every day I'm seeing conservatives start calling out the Epstein files, start on Truth Social or at Turning Point USA, standing up and going, you guys are selling us out. Like, it's clear, right? COVID-19, I saw Democrats come out all over the place, start to say, this is wrong. I'm not taking the next shot. Like, I definitely see this transitioning. And I think that's why a lot of this is getting dangerous. I say it all the time. Like, the government's going to make us uncomfortable because this is not what they want. But I see this as a positive thing right now, you know, and with the shadow of a very dark agenda that we need to kind of stand against. But, you know, what do you think about that? And on that general point, you know, I do feel positive about where it's going.
Yeah, I mean, I do think consistency is key. But I think you have to create your own kind of lodestone and then be consistent to that, regardless of what's going to be thrown at you, because I don't even think we're in the eye of the storm right now. I think, you know, we're going to face far worse than what we've faced already. That's just my opinion. And so if you're not anchored in your vision of what you want your life to be in relation also to your community, to the world, and so on, then you're going to be buffeted by what's incoming. So I guess that's what I try to do, because that's what keeps me grounded despite everything that gets, you know, thrown my way personally, but also collectively. And bear in mind, I guess, you know, we are the majority. I think we always have to remember that. Ultimately, revolutions tend to start with the minority, but ultimately it's the majority that aligns behind the revolution or the resistance that have the power. And when you're disunited, you no longer are the majority. You're then divided into multiple minorities. And I think, you know, that's an image that I always keep in my head. You might disagree with someone, but that doesn't really matter. No one should agree all the time anyway. But I think as human beings, we have to unite behind our natural sense of justice, our natural kind of liberation ideology, because we all kind of follow that, whether we are massively informed about it or not, in the sense that people shouldn't be oppressed. Everyone should have equality. Everyone should have the same opportunities. Everyone should be able to develop and progress and evolve and not be kind of restricted and controlled and managed and told what they should think, what they should feel, and so on. No, that's not who we are.
Yeah, I agree. It's such a vivid picture you just painted there. You know, that's always the case. Divide and conquer. It's a classic idea. You know, we are stronger as a united front, and so the point is always, whether left-right paradigm, whether Muslim versus whatever the false duopoly or binary that they're creating, it's to keep us divided and facing each other instead of the real threat and the real culprit behind most things we're dealing with. So it's always the case to me. But again, like I said, to make it less so that felt like that was unclear when I said it last. not that I'm positive about the agenda they're rolling out, but that people are pushing back like we're seeing. And so I do feel positive about that. So I just hope people can at least consider that, you know, and recognize that we do have, like you were highlighting, the more we're collected and unified against not everything, but the real threat causing strife in our life, then we have power there. So thank you as always, Vanessa. I you know, it's always a mind-opening conversation. So thank you for being here today, and look forward to the next one. Any final thoughts, any upcoming events you want to leave us with?
No, I just wanted to thank you, Ryan, because I think, you know, I've said before, what you do is absolutely crucial in informing people and helping them to find the way forward in what is a very dark agenda that's been rolled out in the world today. And I think what you do is invaluable. So thank you for that, and keep doing it despite all of the setbacks and pressures that I know it brings with it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Vanessa. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.